thank you all for joining us on this webinar, Storm Response in Action, New State Efforts to Help Rebuild. We're really excited to see you all. If you haven't dropped your where you're zooming in from in the chat, we'd love to see that. And so we will get going here. And we have a good day up ahead of us. We got a jam-packed hour, some good conversation. We hope that you ask questions and engage after we hear from our speakers. A little bit of tech stuff for everybody before we get going. So this is a webinar. We have the chat open. If you want to ask a question of our panelists, use the Q&A button down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We have staff monitoring the Q&A, and we'll be able to either answer your question in real time or get it to one of the panelists to answer. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. We also probably won't get to them all. We do have a couple of questions prepared from the last webinar. If any of you were on the last webinar, there were questions that were relevant for these panelists, so we might get those answered today. There's a little bit on audio. If you're having trouble hearing the speaker, you can go to the settings and audio and increase the output level. And if you're having other kinds of Zoom challenges, let us know in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll help you directly. We have a great team on the webinar today, ready to help out. So we'll be following up with today's webinar with a recording and some other helpful information. There'll be a bunch of links that come through in the chat as our speakers are talking, and we'll share those links with you as well. So welcome, everybody. We've got those good preliminary logistics out of the way. I'm Nick Batista, the Chief Policy and External Affairs Officer here at the Island Institute. I'm really excited for this webinar today. We're talking about the storm response and how it's changed state policy. And so the Island Institute, we are located in Rockland, Maine. We boldly navigate climate and economic change with island and coastal communities to expand opportunities and deliver solutions. This webinar is the second in the series of 3 webinars that we're doing this fall, reflecting on the storm and last January's storms and the impact they've had on the state. The first webinar last month, we heard about how climate change is impacting the Gulf of Maine and coastal communities, as well as strategies that the state is incorporating into the newly released Climate Action Plan, Maine Won't Wait. Today, we're continuing the conversation on, and it's focused on how storms have shaped state policy. I think it's fair to say as impactful as the storms were to working waterfronts and to communities along the coast, we've seen a similarly impactful shift in state policy in support of those working waterfronts and those communities that were impacted. I'm very excited today to talk with three key people from state government who are making this work happen. These are all good friends, and our panelists, they're leading work in their respective agencies that have and will continue to have very real, tangible, positive impacts for Maine's island and coastal communities. These 3 have also helped lead and guide the state's response to these storms. And so it's exciting to hear from them about the work that their agencies have been doing and the impact of that work, and then a little bit about what's to come. And so we'll have hear first from Deirdre Gilbert, who's the Director of Policy and Management at the Maine Department of Marine Resources. Then we'll hear from Sarah Kern, who's the Deputy Director for Climate Planning and Community Partnerships in the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. And we'll hear from Rob Wood, who's the Director of the Bureau of Land Resources, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. These are the people who are doing the work on the ground and moving the state forward to address the storm. We're incredibly grateful for their efforts and for the work that they've done, and really excited to hear from them. And so I think without further ado, Deirdre, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. So as Nick said, I'm Deirdre Gilbert. I'm the Director of State Marine Policy at the Department of Marine Resources. And many of you might think of DMR primarily as a resource management agency, but we also do some amount of work on working waterfronts, understanding that for our constituency, anything that we do to manage resources is really not that helpful if folks can't access those resources and have a place to land their catch. So since 2006, the department has administered a working waterfront access protection program. And some of the reasons I just wanted to highlight, the reasons that we do that work is that both culturally and economically, working waterfronts are really important to the state of Maine. Many of you might be aware that just the landed value of Maine's marine resources is over $600 million, sometimes even more than that. And that's just literally what people get paid for their catch. When you take into account the direct and indirect impacts of that activity, we think it's a very conservative estimate to say Maine's commercial fishing industries are worth over $1.5 billion in economic activity. There are over 10,000 license holders and probably over 35,000 jobs associated with this industry. So all of that really relies on working waterfront, which is why, next slide, please. Those January storms were so concerning to DMR and all agencies in the state about what it would mean for the coming fishing season for our license holders. These images are just a few of some flights that were done directly after those January storms to try to understand the extent and nature of the damage that occurred. Obviously, there was a lot that we could see, and then there were also things that we couldn't see because the entire wharves had just been completely taken away. So this was pretty dramatic, and I think everybody understood that a response was needed. So next slide. There were a couple new programs that were created in the direct aftermath of the storms. And I just wanted to focus primarily on the one that I worked on, which is the Working Waterfront Resilience Grants Program. Just as a note, DECD also administered a program that working waterfronts could apply to. We've got some pending federal funding coming for another program, and I'm sure Sarah will speak to the component in the NOAA grant that GoPIF just received. But there were also existing state programs that are still ongoing. So at the end of my presentation, I will touch on those as well. Next slide. So the Working Waterfront Resiliency Grants, the governor first proposed this program in her State of the State that was directly after the January storms. She had proposed this as a standalone piece of legislation that she hoped would pass as an emergency bill. As it entered the legislative process, it ended up getting incorporated into the budget instead of a standalone bill. And the legislature also added some language to help define their intent for how these funds would be used. So it's pretty standard, I would say, that the state might make investments in public infrastructure. It's less common that we're making investments in privately owned infrastructure. So in this case, the legislature specifically called out working waterfront as private infrastructure that has significant community benefits. They specifically defined that what they were looking for us to focus on were the wharves and piers supporting commercial fisheries and aquaculture businesses. They wanted us to focus on projects that could demonstrate that the work that they were doing would increase the resilience of that facility to future storm events. And again, they were looking for the properties that could document or demonstrate a significant and compelling community benefit. So those were kind of the criteria that we designed the program around. Next slide. Again, this was targeted to the properties that were damaged by the storms. We had 25 million available. It did require a one-to-one match, so leveraged about $50 million worth of work along the coast. We had to establish the eligibility criteria based on what the legislature provided. We ended up picking some thresholds in terms of the number of users of the properties. We weren't quite sure how far this money would go. As many of you might be aware, we don't have a great comprehensive inventory of every working waterfront property along the coast of Maine. So we kind of went with our gut. We created 2 tiers, more than 20 users and more than 10 users, but we were able to fund the properties that had at least 10 users. But we were hoping that by picking that number, we might be picking a threshold that the number of applications we would get would be roughly commensurate with the amount of money that we had, and that ended up working out pretty well. We opened up the grant application on May 9th, which was shortly after the legislature passed that legislation. We had a month for applications to come in, so they were due on June 10th. We got 80 applications. We funded all 68 eligible applications. We did get a number of applications that either didn't meet that use threshold or didn't represent a place where people could access or land their catch, so they weren't inherently eligible for the program. All of the eligible projects total about $22.8 million. We made those awards back in July, and the funds became available in August. Once awards were made, the program actually kind of transitioned over to DOT because they control the fund where the money was actually sitting, and they've been doing the contracts with the municipalities and passing those funds out, based on work completed. So they've been kind of in charge since August 9th. Next slide. I just wanted to point out, again, those storms were kind of unique in that they were felt all up and down the coast. So as you might expect, eligible projects also span the length of the coast. They actually went down to New Hampshire border and then all the way up to Lubec. We had some concentrations of projects in Stonington, Harpswell, and then in Portland as well. So those were some of the towns that had significant numbers of projects compared to other places that might have just had 1 or 2. Next slide. I just quickly wanted to touch on what we learned from this process because, like I said, we hadn't really done anything like this before. I wanted to comment that I think that given the very short turnaround on developing applications, the support that the Island Institute and the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association provided to applicants and helping them get their applications in, I think was really critical. It wasn't a lot of time. We tried to make the application as streamlined as possible, but there's always some amount of work in putting those things together. So I think that made a huge difference, having people who could help people put their applications together and get them submitted. We did involve the towns in this project in the sense that when funds were dispersed, they actually went to the local municipality and then from there to the recipient of the funds or the property owner. DOT kind of modeled that process after another process that they use called locally administered projects. I know that there were some growing pains around that, and I think we hopefully, if we ever had to do that again, hopefully it'll go a little bit smoother, but I do think it was a little bit of a learning exercise for everybody involved. I'm kind of coming to the end of my time, so I'll kind of quickly touch on these other things. As I mentioned, we awarded $22.8 million out of $25 million. I think it is helpful to have a little bit of extra money available for awarded projects just because we are finding that a lot of those budgets are coming in higher than what they were originally projected to be. We're still hearing a fair amount about landowners who would like to get some help with design and engineering and permitting, even aside from rebuilding needs, just so they can make informed decisions about what they want to do. And the remaining needs, obviously, we're still trying to assess with additional funds, where would we direct those funds? And lastly, very quickly, like I mentioned, there were programs that existed prior to this particular program that are ongoing. These are mainly geared toward municipalities, but I wanted to make sure folks were aware that these would be happening in 2025. So there are programs that will continue into the future to address some of these needs. And that is all I had.
Well, thank you, Deirdre. Very much appreciate it. For those of you who work regularly with state grants, you'll know that standing up a grant program, getting it out, getting applications in, and making awards on this time frame is an incredible effort. And I think the department, um, those of us who care about the coast owe a lot to the department for the speed with which that was able to happen. Um, greatly appreciated. One thing as we switch to Sarah here, the Department of Economic and Community Development, as Deirdre mentioned, has a business resilience grant program. That program currently has $2 million in it and is open, accepting applications and through early January. And so this is for businesses that suffered economic loss due to the storms either in December 23 or January of 24. And we can drop the link in the chat for that program. Um, all right, Sarah, I think we're on to you. Ready to go fast?
Great. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Curran. I am Deputy Director at the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. We coordinate the work of the Maine Climate Council, and we work collaboratively with other agencies, including DMR and DEP, and lots of stakeholders on policies related to climate resilience and energy. So I'm going to talk today about a couple of things. I want to talk about the Governor's Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission and the interim recommendations that were just released from that commission. I also want to touch on the $69 million climate resilience grant from NOAA that Deirdre just mentioned. And then finally, I want to just highlight the current grant round through the Community Resilience Partnership that is open right now. So that's what I'll focus on this afternoon. Next slide, please. So first, just as some context, the state has a climate action plan called Maine Won't Wait. The plan was first released in December 2020, and we have just released the update to the plan, the 2024 update. So this is an updated climate action plan for the next 4 years. It includes strategies both to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and also to make Maine more resilient to the climate impacts that we are already experiencing. Hundreds of Mainers provided input into the updated climate action plan, lots of work by many working group members and the Climate Council members, and really excited to have that new and updated climate action plan available. The climate action plan has 4 goals: to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to make our state more resilient to climate impacts. There's an emphasis on the creating jobs and the economic opportunity in climate action. And then finally, the 4th goal is around bringing climate action to all Maine people. So making sure that, in particular, the folks who are most vulnerable to climate impacts have the opportunity to benefit from the state's climate strategies. So that includes low-income residents and rural communities. So those 4 goals of the plan. And then next slide, please. There are 7 strategies in the state's climate action plan. So the first few strategies are focused on reducing emissions, so reducing emissions in our transportation and building sectors, transitioning to clean energy. There's, as I was mentioning, a real focus on the opportunity to create jobs and grow Maine's economy through climate action. There's a strategy around protecting the environment and natural working lands and waters. A chapter on building healthy and resilient communities, including resilient infrastructure. And then a chapter on community engagement and outreach and how we make sure that the plan is reaching all Mainers. Next slide, please. So I want to just emphasize that there is a real focus on resilience throughout the climate action planning process this time. These are some photos from a special Climate Council meeting last January, where we had just experienced the December and January storms, and the council met to sort of hear from both impacted communities and state agency leads about what was happening on the ground. And that really framed up the council's approach to updating the state climate action plan, so that resilience was really a framework for this climate action plan. I think what we found is that the storms last winter really drove home for a lot of people that we are experiencing climate impacts now, and kind of conveyed a sense of urgency to the work. Next slide, please. I want to highlight, this is a slide highlighting some of the investments that Deirdre was just mentioning. The governor proposed and the legislature approved $60 million in storm recovery funds last year. So that included the $25 million for working waterfront infrastructure. It also included funding for small businesses. Nick was just mentioning that that program is currently open again. And then it also included $25 million for community infrastructure. So these are projects that are underway right now and working to build the resilience of communities and businesses around the state as we sort of look ahead at the next storm season, which is approaching. Next slide, please. I want to focus a bit on the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission. This is a commission that was named by the governor after the storms last year to really focus on how we effectively rebuild from those storm experiences last winter, and also how we rebuild thoughtfully and how we build, increase our resilience as we're rebuilding from storm events. So the commission was created by executive order. It did a lot of listening sessions to kick off its work, traveling around the state, hearing from impacted communities, and then released the interim recommendations in November. I'm going to go through those briefly. And I also want to point out the final report of the commission is due in May. So the recommendations that were released are the interim report and then the final report coming in May. Next slide, please. So there are three areas of the commission's interim report. They focused on immediate actions to improve storm response. So what are the things that we can be doing right now to build resilience in our communities? They focused on sort of cementing the foundation for resilience. So I'd say these are more midterm recommendations, and then they had some long-term recommendations. Next slide, please. So the first set of recommendations are around immediate actions. And here the commission focused on enhancing communications during and immediately after emergencies, on strengthening the immediate response capabilities, including with the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors to alleviate post-disaster needs, and then focusing on expediting state permitting for post-disaster rebuilding. So that's the first set of recommendations. Next slide. The next set of recommendations in the interim commission report are around sort of building the foundation for resilience. And so this is about increased access to data and information, understanding across the state what our critical infrastructure is and how it's vulnerable, assisting communities to prepare for disasters and plan for increased resilience, maximizing federal funding, making sure that Maine is taking advantage of the federal funding that is available for infrastructure and other resilience projects. There's a focus on energy infrastructure and energy reliance, and then also sort of looking at local and regulatory processes to look at rebuilding. And again, some of those permitting questions, regulatory processes, how we think about those in the context of rebuilding from disaster events like last winter. And then the final set of recommendations, next slide, thank you, integrating resilience for the long term. And so these three recommendations focus on kind of building the long-term capacity to understand risk and communicate about it with communities and residents, thinking about funding and financing strategies for the long term, what it will take to make our infrastructure resilient for the long term. And then thinking about buildings also, sort of what are the practices and best practices around buildings and infrastructure to make them more resilient. So again, those are the interim recommendations. The commission will continue to meet monthly. Those meetings are open to the public. If you want to observe them, they're available on Zoom, and then they'll be delivering their final report this May. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the resilience grant that the state just received this past summer. This was an incredibly competitive grant, and the state received $69 million from NOAA. And our proposal to NOAA focused on three areas of activity. The first is really building enduring community resilience. And so there's funds in this grant for the Community Resilience Partnership, which gives grants to communities for local climate and energy projects. Also funds for the Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund to support resilient infrastructure projects. There's funding for regional coordinators at the regional councils across the state to help communities with identifying those projects, seeking funding for them and implementing them. There's a real focus on nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. So getting best practices together, thinking about the regulatory changes that are needed to promote those projects, and case studies and other sort of ways to share how nature-based solutions can help build climate resilience in Maine. And then the third area of focus is really on working waterfront communities. And so there's funding for, as Deirdre mentioned, additional grant rounds to working waterfronts for infrastructure resilience projects. Next slide, please. And so again, this is a $69 million grant. It is a collaborative grant, so GoPIF together with lots of state agencies and external partners, and it's a 5-year grant. So a really exciting opportunity to put into practice the recommendations of the Climate Council, of the Resilience Commission, and an opportunity to build and strengthen the resilience of our communities across Maine, coastal and inland. Next slide, please. I also want to make sure that I mention the Maine Office of Community Affairs. Part of the NOAA grant will be creating a new state resilience office in the Maine Office of Community Affairs. The Maine Office of Community Affairs is a new office established in the supplemental budget by the governor and approved by the legislature last session. And the idea is that there are a variety of planning, technical assistance, and grants programs that are available to help communities who are facing challenges, including climate resilience, but also affordable housing and other sort of really challenging policy and planning issues. And currently, communities have to go to multiple state agencies to access programs related to planning, technical assistance, and funding. And the new Maine Office of Community Affairs will be a one-stop shop for all of those programs. So in the biennial budget, the governor will propose bringing programs together, reorganizing the programs into a new standalone office. And that includes the Community Resilience Partnership, the grants program that's currently in GoPIF. It also includes programs like the Coastal Program, currently at DMR, the Planning and Technical Assistance Program, which is currently the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, and the Floodplain Program, the Housing Opportunity Program from the Department of Economic Community Development, and the Building Codes Program. All of those programs that currently provide technical assistance around planning issues to communities will be reorganized into this new Office of Community Affairs. And we think that's going to be a really great opportunity to do a better job providing assistance to communities and making it easier for them to access that assistance, particularly for the smaller communities with limited capacity. And next slide, please. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention the Community Resilience Partnership. This is a grant program. It was a recommendation of Maine Won't Wait in 2020. It was stood up by the governor in the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. It provides grants to communities for local climate and energy projects. And so communities enroll in the program and then they're eligible for a grant. The program has distributed more than $9 million in state and federal funding to communities already in the last couple of years. And we are currently, we have our biggest funding opportunity open. Up to $8 million is available in this grant round right now. It's a combination of the state budget funding for this program. The governor requested some additional funding through the supplemental budget in response to the storms to support local resilience projects. And then we have some of the federal funding from the NOAA grant in this grant round as well. So $8 million currently available in this grant round. And we have more than 200 communities participating in the Community Resilience Partnership. And if your community is not participating, I would encourage you to look into it. It's a great way to get support for local climate and energy projects. And then this last slide just talks a little bit more about the open grant round right now. So again, the application is open right now. The deadline is December 17th. It's a $75,000 award to individual communities, up to $175,000 for joint applications. And the projects can be a variety of climate and energy actions that are in alignment with the state climate action plan. So both resilience activities as well as clean energy and emission reduction projects. And with that, I will turn it back to Nick. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. You've had a busy fall. You guys have been busy over in GoPIF, doing some great work, and love both the reports and the plan, and also the money that's heading out to communities. So thank you very much. It's well appreciated. So now we will move to Rob Wood. This is the deep dive into the permitting and regulatory side of things. As Deirdre mentioned, it's complicated and maybe slowing some folks down, probably with good reason. And we thought that it was really important to have Rob here to talk a little bit about some of the great work that DEP is doing and some of the changes that have came out of the storms in last December and last January. So, Rob, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for having me and for having the department. And great to see such a robust audience here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about permitting for what I titled Resilient Working Waterfronts, but really this should be titled Permitting for Resilient Coastal Communities. So as Nick said, I am the director of the Land Bureau at the DEP, and so we administer several state environmental laws. The one that is most relevant for permitting along Maine's coastline is the Natural Resources Protection Act. And so I'm going to dive a little bit into the Natural Resources Protection Act, also known as NERPA. So next slide, please. So the legislature has established a statute that has been on the books now for about 45 years that requires anyone who is going to perform certain activities in, on, or over protected natural resources or adjacent to certain protected natural resources, including coastal wetlands, must first obtain a permit from the state. And so the Title 38 and Section 480C lays out the types of activities that require a permit. Really, kind of any meaningful permanent disturbance to a protected natural resource or adjacent to a protected natural resource will require a NERPA permit from the DEP, again, administered by the Land Bureau. There are many protected natural resources. So just to spell those out, there are rivers, streams, brooks, great ponds, also known as lakes, freshwater wetlands, and then most relevant for coastal communities in most cases will be coastal wetlands. And so that's any area along the coastline that's below the highest annual tide line in a given year. And then also coastal sand dune systems are a protected natural resource. And then there are several other protected natural resources as well: significant wildlife habitat, fragile mountain areas, and community public water system primary protection areas. So I'll go to the next slide, please. So for NERPA permitting, I'm going to touch on kind of a sets of activities and what the permitting requirements are for those activities, and then also some recent changes that have been in response to the storm events last winter. So with the storm events last winter, there have been many folks along the coastline that have needed to repair or rebuild previously existing structures along Maine's coastline. My big picture message here is that most of those activities either do not require a NERPA permit or can be done under permit by rule, as long as the structures are not expanding their footprint. And so if you are just simply repairing a structure and you're keeping the same or keeping the same dimensions that existed previously, or you're even reducing dimensions, that's exempt. If you are replacing a structure that previously existed and you're keeping the same dimensions or reducing those dimensions over what was there previously, that can be done through permit by rule. And permit by rule is a streamlined permitting process that has a shortened review timeline with very clear eligibility criteria and standards for the project. If you're keeping, again, the same or reduced dimensions, you should qualify either for the exemption or for permit by rule. And then also last legislative session, the legislature passed and the governor signed emergency legislation LD 2030, which enacted a number of changes to the Natural Resources Protection Act. A couple of those that are relevant here are that it allows for increasing the height of a pier, wharf, or dock when it's being repaired or replaced, either as an exempt activity or under permit by rule, which was not previously allowed. So we had heard from a lot of folks that when working waterfronts were being rebuilt, or when private coastal piers, wharves, and docks were being rebuilt, the folks wanted to rebuild higher so that they could rebuild stronger, and the legislature passed a law to make that a little bit easier. I also just want to point out that NERPA includes an exemption for repair, maintenance, or replacement of existing crossings. So that includes roads, bridges, and culverts, and other crossings of protected natural resources. There are certain criteria that need to be met, but generally speaking, for example, if you had a culvert along the coastline or near the coastline that, for example, was damaged in the flooding or that blew out in the flooding, that can generally be replaced under as an exempt activity as long as certain criteria are met. So next slide, please. I'm going to next jump into expanding or building new infrastructure, new structures. So this is really where kind of a higher level of review comes in for environmental permitting. If you're expanding a previously existing structure or you're proposing to build a new structure in, on, or over a coastal wetland or within 25 feet of a coastal wetland, that is generally going to require an individual permit. An individual permit has a longer review period, and then the applicant must demonstrate that they're meeting standards in Title 38, Section 480D. There are a number of applicable department rules that come into play when an individual permit is required, listed here at the bottom of the slide. I won't go through all of those, but just to understand that if a structure is being expanded or a new structure is being built, that does require additional environmental review so that the state can ensure that there is no unreasonable impact from that activity. So next slide, please. I do want to touch on emergency actions that involve the placement of new structures because this came up quite a bit last winter, comes up routinely. It's still really coming up to this day, even though we're almost a year out from the January storms. So I just want to make sure folks are aware that temporary structures do not require a permit. So if it's in place temporarily to protect against a storm that's incoming, for example, and then it's removed within 7 months, that's not going to require a NERPA permit in most cases. Also, there's a specific provision in law that allows for a temporary structure to remain in place longer if it's being used to reinforce a threatened seawall, specifically in a coastal sand dune system. So if you live in a coastal sand dune system and you have an existing seawall, take a look at that provision as well. And then I do want to mention that the law allows for after-the-fact permitting of activities under the laws administered by the department, including the Natural Resources Protection Act. And so on a case-by-case basis, we have provided guidance to folks who really needed to build a new structure, for example, to stabilize a shoreline when a house is kind of hanging right on the edge of an eroded bluff, for example, where we said, okay, that's going to take a little bit longer for us to permit under an individual permit. So we will use our enforcement discretion and not require the applicant to get a permit upfront before moving forward with that activity, but then an after-the-fact permit is required. So just want to let folks know that if you really do have an emergency situation, contact the department and we'll try to help you work through that. Next slide, please. I do want to mention that we are looking at some rule changes to, number one, encourage nature-based solutions, as was mentioned before, is a goal of the Climate Action Plan. And so we want to propose some changes to make permitting of nature-based solutions a little bit easier, and then also more generally to streamline and clarify permitting requirements for construction of new coastal shoreline stabilization structures. And so we have seen a really substantial surge in applications for coastal shoreline stabilization projects since the January storms last winter. And so, for example, that includes riprap on coastal bluffs or seawalls along coastal bluffs. And so, to be clear, these proposed rule changes would not change rules for coastal sand dune systems, but this would apply outside of coastal sand dune systems. So, a couple of important changes that those rule revisions would make is first, it would bring some coastal shoreline stabilization projects into permit by rule eligibility. And so currently, one cannot obtain a permit by rule for a coastal shoreline stabilization project. It's not an activity that can be permitted by rule. Where the department is proposing to change its rules to allow for certain coastal shoreline stabilization projects to be permitted by rule if certain standards are met. That would limit the structure to 100 linear feet and a max height of the base flood elevation. And then there are a variety of other standards that are being proposed as well. And then there would be fewer standards and fewer limits on biodegradable materials being used for coastal shoreline stabilization. So take a look at our website. There's a public comment opportunity page. There's also a public hearing next week. If it's really something that you're interested in, there will be a public hearing on December 19th at the Board of Environmental Protection. And then I do want to mention that the rule revisions as well would set clearer standards and limits for projects that don't qualify for PBR. And so what we have seen is that there are relatively vague standards for shoreline stabilization projects that require an individual permit. And so we're trying to be clearer about when an impact will be found to be reasonable versus unreasonable, and that will help streamline the permitting process even when an individual permit is required and the project is not eligible for permit by rule. So that is nearly my last slide. Nick, I know that we're coming up on the end of my time, but I do have just one more slide. I can speak to this in a moment if there's questions about it. Just to note, there are other permitting requirements outside of the state DEP, so keep that in mind. And then lastly, I do have a slide on resources that are available for folks. So we do have a storm recovery resources webpage that we created last winter in response to the storms. And so please check that out. It's still available right on our homepage on the DEP website. And then we are also developing rapidly an online permit application system that should help make the permitting process more efficient for everybody. So I wanted to note that as well. And with that, I will turn it back over.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Very much appreciated. As we get in here, I just had a quick follow-up question for you. You live in a complicated world, as many of the people on this call are maybe coastal property owners or own a working waterfront or have friends who are looking at engaging with this work. In addition to going to DEP, who are the other kinds of people who might help you? Where do you go for resources, support, help to even just sort of get started on this?
Absolutely. So I would recommend starting at the local level. So your local code enforcement officer can not only help with local permitting requirements, but often will have a good working knowledge of state and sometimes federal environmental permitting requirements as well. So your local officials, including the code enforcement officer, can be quite helpful. And then, there are many firms that support environmental permitting and that are familiar with the state process and with the Natural Resources Protection Act. And so those environmental consulting firms are a great resource as well. And then the department, of course, is always happy to be available to answer any questions you have. You can reach us by phone. Our contact information is all over the DEP website. And so and you can reach out to me directly as well with any question, big or small. So please do reach out to the department with your questions. We're very happy to answer questions on the front end, which makes things much easier for everybody moving and through the process.
I was just going to add, it feels like contacting you on the front end is probably much more helpful and easier than finding out on the back end you did something you shouldn't have, and then we all have a problem. Invite the rest of the panelists back in. I've got a question for Deirdre and then Sarah. So Deirdre, we know that some of the working waterfronts in the state have made various resilience investments over the years. A number of them are protected through the Working Waterfront Access Protection Program. Do you have any insights into how those working waterfronts who have made upgrades in the last, say, 10, 15 years have fared in the storms versus those that didn't?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I would say my knowledge of this is kind of anecdotal in nature, kind of what I hear from people. But I definitely had heard in the aftermath of the storms from a few folks who were kind of talking about how glad they were that they made, those relatively modest investments that kind of saved the wharf from more catastrophic damage. The Working Waterfront Access Protection Program that you mentioned, that's the program the department has been running since 2006. It's not a grant program. We buy development rights from a property owner. They can do whatever they want with that money. More often than not, people invest it in the wharf because that is kind of their major need. And I would say we did hear from a number of them that they thought those investments really buffered them against those storm impacts. At the same time, we also made some of the Working Waterfront Resilient Grant awards to properties that are protected with covenants. And to me, that's also a good thing, because the state now has an interest in that property. It's always going to be working waterfront. We want to continue to help maintain that, continue to invest in it. So it kind of worked well in both directions. Whether we gave them money up front or after the fact, we were still kind of investing in those properties.
Great, thank you. We're going to do rapid fire here, I think. Those of you online watching, drop your questions into the chat. Our team will get them either answered or over to the panelists. Sarah, shifting to you. So you talked about Maine Will Wait, the upcoming Infrastructure Resilience Commission report, the NOAA grant. There's a lot of really good activity happening at the state level. How can outside partner organizations like Island Institute, philanthropy, and really the people watching the webinar help support the work that you're doing and the state's doing to build resilience?
Thanks, Nick. That's a great question. I mean, I think the answer is that we all need to be doing the work, right? I think that the state climate action plan, it provides a nice framework, and it helps sort of understand what the strategies are. And it was hundreds of people and lots of great experts and community members and business leaders and scientists who collaborate on developing those recommendations. And so it's a policy document for the state agencies, and it helps us think about policies and programs. But what we've seen is that with the urgency around climate impacts that communities are feeling, the plan doesn't sit on a shelf. And so it's been really heartening to see it be implemented in communities across the state, by nonprofits, by businesses, and it is going to take all of us in order to accomplish the strategies in the plan. So the private sector, nonprofits, philanthropy, the federal government, state agencies, it really is a case where the implementation of the strategies in the plan will need to be across sector and with lots of different partners for them to be successful. And I think the local climate action, the communities setting their own priorities and deciding what's important to them and pursuing those projects, that's been really, really inspiring, and I think is more important than ever as we see events like last winter, and we realize kind of more the sense of urgency that this will take. The community action is fantastic.
Great, thank you. Rob was gonna maybe ask a question coming out of the chat. Don't want to put you on the spot too much, but is DEP working to look at the cumulative impacts of all of the individual hard engineering decisions that happen along our coast? And how should people in the webinar audience, how should we collectively be thinking about addressing cumulative impacts beyond, the impact of one specific project?
Yes, that is one of the age-old questions of the Natural Resources Protection Act. It is a really tough nut to crack. Cumulative impacts. How do we look at that along the shoreline? And it's not just hardened structures. It's other types of infrastructure affecting protected natural resources. Our rules seek to get at cumulative impacts in some ways, and the proposed revisions to the department's Chapter 310 rules that I just mentioned in the presentation that are being considered by the Board of Environmental Protection now, and for which there's a public hearing next Thursday, would set what the department believes are appropriate limits on coastal shoreline stabilization structures that we believe over time will limit cumulative impacts. When you get down to the individual project level, we do also have the ability and the authority to consider whether a single impact, a single proposed project would result in an unreasonable impact based on its cumulative effect, looking at all of the other projects nearby. And so that is something that we attempt to evaluate in every scenario. And so if you have a cove where most of the shoreline is stabilized, and that's reducing sediment supply to the cove. And there's one more project that might really kind of tip the balance in that particular cove. That is something that the department can consider and strives to consider. But we do believe that we need rule revisions that can make it much more predictable and get at those cumulative impacts over the long run. So it's a great question.
Great. Thank you for answering it. So one question for Sarah. How much progress has been made in identifying, mapping, strengthening critical infrastructure, vulnerable coastal infrastructure, sort of, we know that our working waterfronts are vulnerable. Deirdre talked about that, but we also know there's a whole bunch of other coastal infrastructure that's vulnerable. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to think about that, right? One is sort of how do the projects get identified by the communities and kind of bubble up. And I think when you have opportunities like the recent grant rounds or the investments in the regional coordinators capacity, where we have regional capacity to assist communities with identifying their priorities, with planning and prioritizing those projects, and then seeking funding to implement them, it starts to build a pipeline of projects. And so I think that's really, really important as a state, is to sort of be understanding as that pipeline is growing what the urgent needs are, and trying to find sort of what we need to be focusing on as a state. And I think that's also part of what the Resilience Commission will be focused on in this spring as they pivot from the interim report, which I highlighted the recommendations. Their full report is due in May. And I think you'll see that group taking some of the science that the Climate Council has put forward around what we understand about risks and the experiences of last year's storm impacts and what we see as far as what was vulnerable. And I love the question for Deirdre around like projects that we've recently invested in and how did they do relative to other projects. So I think learning from our recent experiences and then kind of overlaying that with some of that climate risk data and then those community priorities, we start to sort of understand the system and where the investments are most critical.
Great. Can't wait to read the Infrastructure Commission report when it comes out. That'll be exciting. I love reading these kinds of reports. As we head towards wrapping up here, I just want to take the moderator's prerogative and say that, I think these storms had an incredible impact on the development of policy in the state. I've been working on working waterfront policy, on coastal issues my entire professional career, and we haven't had a moment like this where there's been this much attention, money, focus, changes to regulations to enable communities and people, small businesses, to become more resilient in the face of climate change. And so kudos to all of you for leading that work in your respective agencies. Want to note it's not just happening here in Maine. Our congressional delegation, both Senator King and Representative Pingree, have introduced a tax credit to help working waterfronts, small businesses that are working waterfronts, make resilience improvements. It's a 30% investment tax credit. So if you invest, $1 million in your working waterfront and make it more resilient, you could get 30% of that back through the tax credit. And so that's just one example of how Maine is leading beyond Maine and working nationally. As we head towards a close here, I have a question for the three panelists, and it's what gives you hope for Maine's communities, working waterfront businesses, and the future as we think about what's coming with climate change? And so maybe we'll start with, well, I'll let you figure out who's ready to go. Sarah, you look ready. Deirdre, maybe.
I'll go. So we've been talking about resilience in terms of infrastructure all this time, and I've actually been thinking how appropriate it is also to think about it in terms of Maine people and kind of what I saw in the aftermath of those storms. It was obviously pretty devastating to people, and they lost infrastructure that had, maybe existed for generations. I saw people kind of question whether they wanted to rebuild it, and obviously everybody needs to do what's right for them, but it seemed like more often than not, people decided they did want to continue to invest in those properties, keep those properties operating as they had in their community. So I think, what gives me hope is not just kind of resilient infrastructure, but the resilient people along the coast.
Gives me hope too. Sarah, Rob?
That's a great answer, Deirdre. I think what I would add to that is just, I have been so struck by the leadership of the communities. I mean, the Community Resilience Partnership Program that we launched, and having more than 200 communities now engaged and participating, identifying local priorities, taking action, implementing projects. I think that it is critical to have a state climate action plan that sort of sets policy and creates a framework and a context, and the real magic happens at the local level. And so seeing that community leadership and those projects, I think that's really impactful.
Wonderful. And enabling that community leadership through state policy, supportive funding, those kinds of things. Rob?
Those are really tough answers to follow, and I will just echo everything Deirdre and Sarah said, certainly. Would just add that I think the appetite from Maine people that we see at the department every day to work together towards solutions and find common sense solutions to these challenges that are in front of us, and the engagement in that as represented here today by the wonderful attendance in an event like this, I think certainly gives me hope that we're going to find the right solutions for Maine.
Wonderful. And we know that when we work with our communities, those collaborative solutions is really where the magic happens. And that's a really important point. So thank you all for coming. In closing, we'll be sending a follow-up email with some links from the slide, the ones that are in the chats, with a recording, the PowerPoint, all of those. Thank you to everybody who participated. Thank you to those who have registered for the next storm recovery webinar series. This is going to be January 16th at 10 a.m. and you'll hear from a couple of working waterfront business owners about what they have experienced over the last year. If you attended some of our webinars in the winter of 2024, you would have heard from some of these participants. So we'll be following back up with them. If you're interested in a particular topic, please let us know. Please reach out. We're always looking for good, useful topics that people want to hear more about. So thank you again to our audience for coming, for listening, for staying with us. And thank you for our panelists for joining and sharing your knowledge. You're all doing incredible work to support Maine's communities. We deeply appreciate everything you are doing and how you're working to move the state forward, to move our coastal communities forward, and to build a more resilient future for the state. So thank you, everybody.